For 10 years, her husband said the room was too important for her, and then in a single breath, she made that room remember her name. The ballroom of the Whitmore International Gala shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, all gold light and old money. The kind of room where every smile looked polished and every secret wore black tie. Naomi Carter stood near the far end of the marble hall in a midnight silk gown that clung not to vanity, but to certainty, her gloved fingers resting lightly over the stem of a sparkling water glass, as though she had always belonged beneath that kind of light. No one noticed her at first. That had been Ethan's design for a decade. His wife had always remained behind gates, behind tinted windows, behind carefully edited narratives. In 10 years of marriage, Ethan Whitmore had never once taken Naomi to a charity gala, a board celebration, an embassy dinner, or even a Christmas cocktail party. He sent donations in her name, flowers on holidays, diamonds on anniversaries, but never an invitation. Never a place at his side. Never a public claim. Tonight, however, fate had grown tired of silence. At the center of the room, a distinguished European diplomat lifted his champagne glass and shifted effortlessly from English into French, his remarks elegant, fast, and far beyond the comfort of the socialites smiling around him. Vanessa Hale, brilliant on magazine covers and flawless in photographs, froze beside Ethan with a smile that tightened at the corners. A few guests laughed politely without understanding a word. Ethan himself offered the kind of stillness powerful men use when they hope confidence will disguise confusion. And then Naomi spoke. Her voice entered the room like a violin note, low, warm, unmistakably refined. She answered in fluent French, not hurried, not eager, but with the graceful precision of someone who had once been taught that language was not merely speech, but posture, history, and power. The diplomat's face transformed instantly. Surprise gave way to delight. Heads turned. Forks stilled. Conversations dissolved into a hush, so complete Naomi could hear the faint fountain in the courtyard beyond the terrace doors. Ethan looked at her the way men look at a memory they had buried alive. Naomi did not rush to fill the silence. She stood with her shoulders relaxed, her chin lifted, her deep brown skin luminous beneath the chandeliers, and the old family sapphire at her throat caught the light with quiet authority. In that moment, she did not look like a billionaire's forgotten wife. She looked like the only person in the room who had nothing to prove. The diplomat laughed softly and replied with admiration, and Naomi answered again, this time with the effortless fluency of someone who had spent years shrinking a brilliance that had never actually disappeared. Around them, whispers moved like wind through silk. Who is she? How does she know him? Wasn't that Ethan Whitmore's wife? Ethan's mouth parted, but no words came. Because some humiliations are loud, and others arrive dressed in elegance. Some betrayals happen in hotel rooms and hidden text messages. Others happen over 10 long years, one unopened door at a time. And as Naomi met her husband's stunned gaze from across the ballroom he had never allowed her to enter, the night peeled open like a wound gilded in gold, and the truth returned with perfect posture. Ethan Whitmore had not hidden an ordinary woman from the world. He had hidden a woman who could have outshined it. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured in delicate pieces, like lights slipping across cut crystal, until the ballroom slowly remembered how to breathe. A server passed with a silver tray of champagne flutes. Someone near the orchestra gave a nervous laugh. Vanessa Hale adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist with the smooth precision of a woman who had spent years recovering elegantly from moments that should have embarrassed her more than they did. But Naomi stood untouched by the room's discomfort, her expression calm, almost serene, as though she had not just shifted the gravity of the entire evening with nothing but her voice. The diplomat, Monsieur Laurent Beecham, still smiling, inclined his head toward her with old-world courtesy. "Madam, your French is exquisite," he said, returning to English now that everyone around him could follow. "It is a pleasure to hear it spoken properly again." Naomi offered a small smile, the kind that did not ask permission to exist. "Thank you. My grandmother believed language should be worn with respect, the same way one wears a family name." The line settled over the room with quiet force. Several guests nodded as though they understood more than they actually did. Ethan did not move. From across the polished floor, he looked devastatingly composed in his custom tuxedo, broad-shouldered and controlled. Every inch the billionaire who had built an empire from disciplined instinct and inherited expectation. But Naomi knew his stillness better than anyone. She knew the difference between his boardroom calm and his private alarm. This was alarm. This was the look he wore when something had slipped outside his control. For 10 years, Ethan Whitmore had controlled the frame. He decided which photographers got access, which dinners mattered, which charities deserved attention, which women belonged on his arm beneath the flash of cameras and the approving gaze of old money families. Naomi had once mistaken that control for protection. In the first year of their marriage, when he told her the business world was ruthless and shallow, she believed he was shielding her tenderness. In the third year, when he kissed her forehead before leaving alone for another gala and promised, next time, she let herself be patient. By the fifth, patience had become habit. By the eighth, habit had become silence. And silence, Naomi had learned, could be the most expensive room in a marriage. "Ethan," Vanessa said softly, her red lips barely moving, "you did not tell me your wife spoke French." The word wife landed with visible discomfort, as though it had not belonged in her mouth until tonight. Ethan finally crossed the floor, not rushed, not careless, but with the deliberate pace of a man trying to restore order before people noticed it had ever been lost. Naomi watched him come toward her beneath the chandeliers that had once felt reserved for people like him. Tonight they belonged to the truth. "Naomi," he said, stopping a breath away, his tone low and polished. "I did not know you were coming." It was not an apology. It was not surprise. It was an accusation dressed in silk. Naomi lifted her eyes to his. "That makes two of us," she said gently. The guests nearest them pretended not to listen with the focused intensity of people who would absolutely repeat every word tomorrow over brunch. Ethan's jaw tightened for only a second. "We should talk privately." "After 10 years of private," Naomi replied, her voice almost tender, "I think public is finally being fair." A ripple moved through the crowd then, subtle but unmistakable. Not pity for her. Recognition. The kind that changes a woman's position in a room forever. Vanessa looked away first. Monsieur Beecham, perhaps sensing more than etiquette required, began speaking to another guest. The orchestra resumed with a soft sweep of strings. And Naomi, standing in the center of a world that had been kept from her for a decade, realized something with startling clarity. She was not overdressed. She was not underprepared. She was not the mistake in Ethan Whitmore's carefully curated life. She was the truth he had hidden because he feared what the world might see once she stood in the light. And now that she had, the night had only begun. Later, when Naomi tried to remember the exact moment her marriage had begun to disappear, she would not think of a slammed door or a shouted insult, because Ethan Whitmore had never been careless enough to wound in obvious ways. No, the beginning of the end had looked far more elegant than that. It had looked like polished shoes in a marble foyer, a black town car waiting at the curb, and a husband adjusting his cuff links beneath warm chandelier light while telling his wife, with a distracted smile, that the evening would be terribly dull and she would be much happier staying home. In the early years, she had believed him. Their house on the Upper East Side had felt like something from a magazine spread, all limestone, muted art, and windows so tall they turned rain into theater. Naomi had arrived there as a new bride at 27, carrying more books than luggage and a softness Ethan once claimed made the whole place feel human. He had kissed her, hand in the kitchen, while she learned where the good plates were kept. He had listened to her stories about her grandmother's French novels and her mother's obsession with classical music. He had told her she made silence feel like luxury. At night, when Manhattan glowed beyond the glass, she would curl into the corner of the library sofa while he finished one more email, and he would glance up at her with that rare private warmth that made the rest of the world seem distant and unimportant. Back then, Naomi thought privacy meant intimacy. She did not yet understand how easily privacy could become erasure. The first gala invitation arrived 6 months into their marriage, embossed cream stock with gold lettering and a private note from the host saying they looked forward to meeting Mrs. Whitmore. Naomi remembered the quiet excitement that bloomed in her chest. She had stood in their dressing room holding 2 gowns against herself, one in deep navy silk and one in ivory satin, laughing softly as she asked Ethan which one belonged in a room full of senators, donors, and museum trustees. Ethan had looked up from his phone, then away, too quickly for a newlywed to interpret correctly. "Do you mind sitting this one out?" he had said. "It is mostly legacy families and old bored people. It will be stiff. Boring. Not your scene." Naomi had let the navy dress slip from her fingers. "I can do boring." He had crossed the room then, gentle and handsome and impossible to argue with when he wanted to be kind. He kissed her temple. "I know you can. I just want one part of my life to stay untouched by performance." It sounded romantic in the way certain disappointments do when they arrive in beautiful language. So she stayed home. She lit the candle he liked in the library. She reheated a bowl of tomato soup at 10:30 and told herself she preferred the quiet anyway. A week later, she saw photographs online. Ethan under a chandelier beside governors and philanthropists. Ethan smiling at a woman in emerald sequins whose family had owned newspapers for 3 generations. Ethan looking exactly like a man whose life was complete. No one asked where his wife was. Or maybe they did, and he answered well enough that it stopped matching. After that, the patterns settled over their marriage like dust over silver. An investment dinner in Boston. A winter charity ball in Aspen. A political fundraiser in Washington. A summer yacht event off the coast of Rhode Island. Every time, there was a reason. The room would be too rigid. The press would be annoying. The families would be cruel. The conversation would drag. At first, Naomi defended him to herself. Ethan worked 80-hour weeks. He was tired. He was protecting her from the sharper corners of his world. Then came the small humiliations no one else could see. A holiday card from one of his business partners addressed only to Mr. Whitmore. A magazine profile that described him as intensely private, with no mention of marriage. A museum donor wall that listed his name alone, though the gift had been made from a joint account. Naomi never screamed. She never threw a glass or demanded a scandal. She simply folded each omission into herself until Grace began to feel dangerously close to disappearance. One October evening, standing at the front window in cashmere socks while the first cold rain of the season streaked the glass, she watched Ethan step into a waiting car for yet another event she had not been invited to. He looked back once, lifted a hand, and smiled that distant smile men wear when they think affection can cover neglect. The taillights blurred into the wet Manhattan night, and Naomi saw her reflection in the window beside the empty room behind her. A beautiful house. A beautiful marriage. A woman no one had ever been asked to meet. That was the night she first understood the rule Ethan had never dared say aloud. He did not want a wife beside him in public. He wanted a wife preserved in private, where she could never disturb the version of himself he had built for the world. And once a woman understands she is being hidden, she begins, quietly, to remember who she was before she agreed to disappear. The invitation was hidden in the back of Ethan's study drawer beneath a stack of briefing notes and a leather folder stamped with the Whitmore Global seal, as though the truth itself had been filed under business. Naomi had not been looking for anything dramatic. She had gone into the study that afternoon searching for a postage stamp because one of her aunt's old friends in Baltimore still insisted on handwritten correspondence, and Naomi, unlike most of the world Ethan moved through, believed some things deserved paper. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the climate control and the distant tap of rain against the rear windows. She opened the drawer expecting envelopes, maybe a pen, perhaps the silver letter opener Ethan's father had given him at Princeton. Instead, her fingers brushed thick cream cardstock edged in black and gold. The kind of invitation meant to impress before it was even opened. The Whitmore International Foundation Autumn Gala, Saturday evening, 8 o'clock, at the St. Clair Grand. Formal attire required. Her eyes moved lower. Ethan Whitmore and guest. Not Ethan and Naomi. Not Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore. Guest. The words sat on the page like an insult too polished to leave fingerprints. For a moment, she simply stared. Rain traced slow lines down the glass behind her, and somewhere upstairs a floorboard settled with the lonely sound old houses make when they are holding more silence than they were built for. Naomi turned the card over. Tucked inside was a smaller note from Vanessa Hale, written in sharp slanted script that looked expensive and overpracticed. Looking forward to Saturday. Lauren Beecham is confirmed. We will need to be especially polished. Especially polished. Naomi read the line twice, then a third time, and something inside her went still in a way far more dangerous than heartbreak. She did not cry. That was the strange part. No dramatic collapse. No trembling hand over her mouth. Just a deep, clarifying quiet, the kind that descends when a woman stops asking whether she has misunderstood and finally admits that she has not. Ethan had not forgotten to mention the gala. He had not assumed she would not be interested. He had not been protecting her from discomfort or press or the stale rituals of old money. He had chosen not to bring her. Again, deliberately, precisely, with another woman helping. Coordinate the evening. Naomi placed the note back in the envelope with care, so exact it felt ceremonial. Then she returned the entire thing to the drawer exactly as she had found it and closed the study door behind her. That night, Ethan came home after 7 carrying the scent of rain and cedar and Manhattan air, loosening his tie as he crossed the foyer while speaking to someone on his phone about market exposure in Zurich. He ended the call when he saw her in the dining room. Naomi had set the table with the white china they only used on holidays. Candles glowed against the window panes. The roast chicken rested untouched at the center beside rosemary potatoes and green beans with almonds. She looked beautiful in a soft black sweater and pearl studs, the kind of beauty that did not announce itself because it had never needed to. "You cooked," Ethan said, surprised, as if domestic grace were something he still had the right to expect. "I wanted us to eat together," Naomi replied. Her voice was even. Ethan sat across from her, reaching for his water glass. "I may need to keep it quick. Saturday is becoming complicated." Naomi lifted her fork, then set it down again. "Yes," she said. "I know." He looked up. "Know what?" "About the gala." Nothing in his face moved at first. That was one of Ethan's gifts, the ability to hold expression in place even when the truth had begun pressing against it from behind. "I was going to tell you," he said at last. "Were you?" "Naomi." He exhaled softly, patient in the way powerful men become when they are preparing to explain your own pain back to you. "It is not what you think." She held his gaze. "Then tell me what I should think when my husband attends another public event with a guest instead of his wife." He leaned back in his chair, fingers loosely folded, voice cooling by the second. "That room is complicated. International donors. Diplomats. Board politics. Every word matters." Naomi's expression did not change. "I speak carefully. That is not what I mean." "I know," she said. The candles flickered between them, their gold light too warm for the chill settling into the room. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Vanessa is handling media coordination. She knows the environment. She can move through those conversations without effort." Naomi let the silence sit just long enough to reveal the cruelty hiding beneath the sentence. "And you believe I cannot?" Ethan looked at her then, really looked, but not with tenderness. With calculation. With the familiar, devastating instinct to manage perception before emotion. "I believe," he said quietly, "that you would not know how to survive that room." The words landed without noise. That was the merciless thing about certain betrayals. They did not explode. They entered the body cleanly and changed the temperature of everything inside it. Naomi did not reach for her glass, did not defend herself, did not remind him of the languages she spoke, the books she had studied, the grandmother who had raised her to move through any room with grace. She simply sat there in the candlelight and realized that the lie had finally found its voice. After 10 years of absence, after 10 years of polished excuses and private tenderness used as a substitute for public honor, Ethan had said the one sentence that ended what was left of their marriage. Not because it was the cruelest thing he had done, but because it was the first time he had stopped disguising it. Naomi did not answer him that night. She did not rise from the table in outrage or deliver the kind of speech that leaves a man comforted by the idea that at least the pain had been dramatic enough to understand. Instead, she folded her napkin beside her untouched plate, stood with the same calm she had once mistaken for devotion, and carried her silence upstairs. Ethan remained in the dining room as though he expected time to soften what he had said, as though the right amount of waiting might turn cruelty back into strategy. But some sentences do not fade after they are spoken. They sharpen. In their bedroom, the lamps cast a low amber glow across the upholstered bench at the foot of the bed, and the framed black and white photographs Ethan had chosen because they made the room look expensive without revealing anything personal. Naomi moved through that familiar space with an unnerving steadiness. She opened the cedar wardrobe, took out a medium-sized suitcase, and laid it flat on the bed. Not the large luggage reserved for vacations. Not a dramatic gesture. Just enough room for the clothes a woman takes when she has no intention of returning quickly and no interest in making a performance out of leaving. She packed cashmere sweaters, 2 wool coats, dark jeans, soft blouses, the leather notebook her mother had given her at graduation, and the old fountain pen that still wrote in clean blue ink. Then she crossed to the velvet box in the top drawer of her dresser and lifted the sapphire necklace she had worn only once in the past decade, on a private anniversary dinner Ethan held at home, because, as always, it had been easier not to be seen. She held the necklace in her palm for a moment, the stones cool against her skin, and almost laughed at the absurdity of it. He had always known how to buy beauty. He had simply never known how to honor it. When Ethan finally entered the room, he stopped at the sight of the open suitcase. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice lower now, less controlled. Naomi continued folding a cream silk blouse with precise hands. "I am leaving for a while." Ethan stared at her as though the possibility had never truly occurred to him. Because of one conversation. She looked up then, and her eyes were so clear, so absent of chaos, that he seemed to lose his footing without taking a single step. "No," she said softly. "Because of 10 years of them." He crossed the room, all polished urgency and restrained frustration, the posture of a man who did not shout because he had spent a lifetime learning that quiet authority could win more efficiently than anger. "Naomi, you are overreacting." The word landed badly. Overreacting. The favorite refuge of men who confuse a woman's delayed response with the absence of injury. Naomi zipped the side compartment of her suitcase and turned to face him fully. "Do you know what is remarkable, Ethan?" she asked. "You have hidden me for so long that even now, with a suitcase on the bed, you still think this is emotion instead of conclusion." He opened his mouth, then closed it. For once, language failed the man who had built entire mergers on timing and tone. Naomi slipped off her wedding ring then, not theatrically, not with trembling fingers, but with the measured grace of someone removing a piece of jewelry that no longer matched the life she intended to wear. She set it on the dresser beside his watch, gold and platinum beneath lamplight, 2 circles reflecting 2 very different ideas of time. Ethan's face changed then, not into remorse exactly, but into something closer to disbelief. "You would leave over a gala." Naomi shook her head. "I am leaving because you made me feel like a problem to be managed instead of a wife to be claimed." The room seemed to contract around the truth of it. Outside, rain moved in silver ribbons down the windows overlooking the city. Somewhere below, a siren rose and faded into the Manhattan night. Ethan took one step closer. "Where will you go?" "Somewhere I do not have to earn the right to be seen." He reached for her wrist then, not hard, not cruel, but with a suddenness that revealed more fear than tenderness. Naomi looked down at his hand, and he let go almost immediately. It was the first time in years he had touched her without certainty. She lifted the suitcase from the bed. Its weight was modest, manageable, honest. At the door she paused, not because she doubted herself, but because endings deserve witnesses. Ethan stood in the middle of the room they had shared for a decade, immaculate and speechless beneath warm light that could not soften him. Naomi met his eyes one last time and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like peace, that men such as Ethan rarely noticed what they had until it stopped waiting for them to become worthy of it. Then she walked out, carrying no raised voice, no broken object, no theatrical grief. Only dignity. And for the first time in 10 years, dignity was more than enough. Naomi's car did not take her to a hotel. It did not take her to a friend's penthouse or some dramatic hideaway with skyline views and room service meant to soften heartbreak into elegance. It took her to Brooklyn Heights, to a tree-lined street where the brownstones wore history more honestly than wealth ever could. The building had belonged to her grandmother Eleanor DuPont Carter, a woman who spoke 3 languages before breakfast, believed in polished shoes and private standards, and once told Naomi that the difference between being overlooked and being forgotten was whether you remembered yourself first. Naomi let herself in with the old brass key she had kept at the bottom of her handbag for years, more relic than tool, and stepped into the quiet apartment that still smelled faintly of cedar, paper, and lavender soap. Nothing in it was new. The floors creaked in familiar places. The fireplace had not been lit in years. A porcelain bowl still sat on the entry table waiting for gloves no one had worn since the last real winter her grandmother was alive. Yet the moment Naomi crossed the threshold, the air changed. Not because pain had disappeared, but because shame had. This was not the kind of place Ethan Whitmore would ever have chosen. There was no doorman, no imported stone, no discreet staff moving soundlessly through polished halls. But there was memory here, and memory, Naomi was beginning to understand, could be a far more honest luxury than status. She carried her suitcase up the narrow staircase and set it beside the old iron bed in the guest room that had once belonged to her mother before law school and ambition carried her north to Boston. The wallpaper was cream with tiny faded blue flowers. On the dresser sat a framed photograph of Naomi at age 12, smiling beside Eleanor on the steps of the New York Public Library, both of them in gloves, both of them holding books as though they were carrying sacred things. Naomi changed into soft gray pajamas, washed her face, and stood for a long time at the sink staring at the woman in the mirror. She did not look shattered. That was what startled her. She looked tired, yes. Hurt, certainly, but not broken. Her deep brown eyes still held their shape. Her mouth, even now, carried the memory of composure. Ethan had not destroyed her. He had merely delayed her return to herself. Sleep did not come easily. The apartment was quiet in a way that made every thought sound louder. Near midnight, she gave up on rest and wandered into Eleanor's old study, switching on the green-shaded desk lamp that cast a pool of warm light across the room. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. French literature, diplomatic memoirs, art history, music theory, essays on language, race, migration, and power. Naomi ran her fingers along the spines with the tenderness some people reserve for family portraits. In truth, these books were family portraits. They told the story Ethan had never cared enough to ask about. He had married beauty, grace, and mystery, then treated mystery as emptiness because it was easier than doing the work of understanding depth. On the desk lay a stack of letters tied with navy ribbon. Naomi recognized her grandmother's elegant hand immediately. Curiosity, or perhaps instinct, led her to untie them. The first was written in French to a cultural attaché in Geneva. The second in English to a museum director in Washington. The third in Italian, discussing an exhibition on Black American composers in post-war Europe. Naomi sat down slowly. She knew these things in pieces, as family lore and half-remembered dinner stories, but here they were in ink, undeniable. Eleanor had not merely loved language. She had moved through international cultural circles with authority. She had advised, translated, lectured, hosted. Her home had once welcomed scholars, musicians, ambassadors, and artists. Naomi's mother, Vivian Carter, had grown up in rooms where brilliance was expected, not explained. And Naomi herself had inherited more than soft manners and a measured voice. She had inherited a legacy Ethan had mistaken for quietness simply because it did not arrive with arrogance. By 2 a.m, the desk around her had filled with fragments of herself she had not touched in years. A college debate medal tucked inside a dictionary. A program from a youth language institute in Montreal. A leather folder containing essays Naomi had written at 21 on translation as power and belonging. There was even an unopened envelope from Columbia's School of International Affairs, preserved in a file Eleanor had labeled in neat script, for when she is ready to remember. Naomi held the envelope in both hands, her throat tightening for the first time since she had left Ethan's house. Years ago, she had deferred graduate school because Ethan's schedule was impossible, because his expansion years were delicate, because marriages, she believed then, required one person to bend more beautifully than the other. She had called it support. In the quiet truth of her grandmother's study, it looked much more like surrender. Dawn began to pale the windows by the time Naomi finally stood. Outside, the city was waking in soft grays and silver, delivery trucks humming faintly below, coffee shops lifting their metal gates, the East River catching the first weak light of morning. Naomi crossed to the mirror above the mantel and looked at herself again, but this time she did not search for damage. She searched for resemblance. And there, in the line of her shoulders, the steadiness of her gaze, the calm set of her mouth, she saw Eleanor. She saw Vivian. She saw the women Ethan had never truly seen inside her because he had spent too long looking only at what he could display and what he could hide. Naomi touched the sealed Columbia envelope once, then placed it beside the letters on the desk with deliberate care. The night had not healed her. Healing was not that theatrical. But something cleaner had happened in its place. The ashes had shifted. The woman Ethan believed he had left standing uncertain in candlelight had arrived somewhere older, deeper, and infinitely more dangerous to underestimate. She had come home, and home had remembered her. Morning in Brooklyn Heights arrived without ceremony, and Naomi found that she trusted it more for that. The light that slipped through her grandmother's lace curtains was pale and honest, not the dramatic gold that once washed across Ethan's limestone walls and made everything look more romantic than it was. Here, daylight did not flatter. It revealed dust on the bookshelf, fine cracks in the painted trim, the faint water ring on the desk where Eleanor had once forgotten a teacup while correcting one of Naomi's essays. Naomi stood barefoot in the kitchen, wrapping both hands around a ceramic mug of black coffee, and listened to the building settle into another day. Somewhere downstairs, a radio murmured jazz behind a neighbor's door. Outside, the city moved in practical rhythms, delivery trucks, footsteps, the sharp hiss of a bus pulling to the curb. Life was continuing without waiting for her to be ready, and strangely, that felt merciful. Her phone had been silent through the night, but by 8:15 it began to glow with Ethan's name. One call, then another, a third, followed by a message that appeared on the screen and vanished before she opened it, as though urgency itself had become embarrassed. Naomi placed the phone face down beside the sugar bowl and drank her coffee while the sound of it vibrating against old wood rose and faded like a distant machine she no longer intended to service. By 10 o'clock she had opened every window in the apartment, letting in crisp October air that carried the scent of leaves, pavement, and roasted coffee from the corner cafe. She stripped the guest bed, shook out the blankets, wiped down the study desk, and polished the brass on the front door until it caught the light again. It was not avoidance. It was restoration. There was a difference, and women like Naomi learned it late because the world had trained them to believe any act of self-tending was indulgence unless it benefited someone else. In the hallway closet, she found an old storage box labeled in Eleanor's script. Naomi, aged 16 to 24. Inside were pieces of a self she had not visited in years. Debate ribbons, a music recital program, a photo of herself in a cream coat outside a language institute in Montreal, smiling into winter wind. A stack of papers clipped together with a note from her grandmother. You do not need permission to enter rooms built on ideas. Beneath the note was an article from a college journal Naomi had once written under her full name, Naomi Elise Carter, on the politics of translation and how language could either dignify or diminish the people asked to live inside it. She sat at the kitchen table and read her own words like they belonged to a woman she had admired from a distance and then lost contact with. The voice in the essay was sharp, elegant, and unsparing. It was the voice of someone who understood that invisibility was rarely accidental. That power often worked by choosing who got to sound articulate, who got introduced properly, who was assumed to belong before they had spoken a single word. Naomi pressed the page flat beneath her palm and felt an emotion far steadier than grief begin to rise. Recognition, not of what Ethan had done. She already knew that. Recognition of what she had allowed herself to set aside in order to keep peace with a man who loved refinement more than truth. At noon the buzzer sounded. Naomi went still for one breath, then crossed the apartment with the same measured composure that had carried her out of Ethan's house. She did not need to look through the peephole to know who it was. Ethan Whitmore did not arrive at doors lightly. He arrived because he expected the architecture of the world to bend around the force of his presence. Naomi, he said when she opened the door only halfway. He was still in yesterday's coat, his tie gone, the shadow at his jaw darker than usual, his steel blue eyes carrying something close to exhaustion. For the first time in 10 years, he looked like a man who had not been granted entry. You left your medication, he said, holding out a small leather case. Naomi glanced at it and almost smiled. Vitamins. Aspirin. The travel pouch she kept in her handbag. Thoughtful, perhaps. Or strategic. With Ethan, care and control had always worn each other's cologne. Thank you, she said, taking it from his hand but not widening the door. He looked past her shoulder into the apartment, taking in the narrow hallway, the old molding, the books visible through the open study door. So this is where you came. This is where I returned. The correction landed more cleanly than any accusation. Ethan's gaze shifted back to hers. Naomi, I should not have said what I said. No, she replied. You should not have believed it. That silenced him. On the sidewalk below, someone laughed. A dog barked twice. A gust of wind sent a swirl of copper leaves skimming along the curb. Life, again, refusing to pause for private reckonings. Ethan lowered his voice. Come home. Naomi studied him. This man who had mastered acquisitions, negotiations, public statements, risk management, and all the elegant instruments of influence, yet still stood helpless before a woman asking only to be honored in daylight. I am home, she said. Something flickered across his face then, not anger exactly, but the first real contact with consequence. He had assumed distance would be temporary because in his world it always was. Flights were rerouted. Meetings were rescheduled. Markets corrected. Problems returned to heal under enough pressure. But Naomi was no longer a problem. She was a decision. This does not have to become something bigger, he said carefully. Naomi's eyes did not leave his. It already was. You just kept it small enough to fit behind closed doors. He stood there a moment longer, handsome and deeply unprepared, the autumn light making his polished certainty look strangely thin. Then he nodded once, as if business decorum might still save him from emotional truth, and stepped back from the threshold. Naomi closed the door softly, not with triumph, not with cruelty, simply with clarity. Then she turned, carried the leather case to the kitchen table, and placed it beside the old article bearing her full name. One version of her life had been managed with precision, dressed beautifully, and hidden from view. The other had begun in a worn Brooklyn apartment with open windows, cold coffee, and a woman rediscovering the sound of her own mind. By evening, Naomi had made 2 calls. The first was to Columbia, where a calm administrator confirmed that deferred applications could not be revived after so many years, but encouraged her to reapply if she wished. The second was to the director of a small but respected cultural foundation in Manhattan that her mother had once served on, a woman named Helen Mercer who remembered Eleanor Carter with reverence. Helen listened for less than 3 minutes before saying, with unmistakable warmth, "If you are your grandmother's granddaughter, then I suspect you have been absent from the right rooms for far too long." Naomi looked out the window at the city gathering dusk over brick and river and church steeples. The old shame was still there, faint as a bruise fading under skin, but something stronger had taken its place. Hunger, not for revenge, for return. And when a woman stops begging to be welcomed and begins preparing to arrive on her own terms, the world does not feel safer. It feels warned. 3 weeks changed the texture of Naomi's life more than 10 years of marriage ever had. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were deliberate. Every morning she left the Brooklyn brownstone by 8:30, wrapped in a camel coat or charcoal wool, depending on the weather, a leather portfolio tucked beneath her arm, and crossed the city with the quiet purpose of someone no longer asking where she belonged. Helen Mercer's foundation occupied the 4th floor of a dignified limestone building near Gramercy Park, the kind of place that had no need to advertise itself because the right people already knew the address. The brass plaque by the entrance read Mercer Institute for Cultural Exchange, and beneath it, in smaller lettering, language, memory, and public life. Naomi paused the first morning before stepping inside, not out of fear, but because certain thresholds deserved to be felt. Then she entered, and the building seemed to greet her in Eleanor's old vocabulary of seriousness and grace. The Institute did not resemble Ethan's world. There were no mirrored lobbies, no assistants in identical black suits, no walls designed to intimidate investors. Instead, there were books, paintings on loan from private collections, a grand piano in the reception room that looked as though someone still expected music to matter. The staff spoke in full sentences and asked thoughtful questions. They did not glance twice at Naomi's skin, her composure, or the fact that she carried old-world polish without apology. They simply recognized competence when it stood in front of them. By the end of her first week, she had translated donor correspondence from French and Italian, corrected a brochure on post-war Black American composers in Paris, and quietly rescued a luncheon conversation when a visiting curator from Brussels switched languages and the room stalled. Helen had watched from the end of the table, silver-haired and clear-eyed, and later said only, "Your grandmother would not be surprised." Naomi carried that sentence home like a small flame. The rebuilding was not only professional. It moved through her life in subtler ways. She stopped wearing the watch Ethan had given her on their 7th anniversary because it felt less like time and more like ownership. She had her natural curls shaped by a stylist in Fort Greene who spoke little and worked like an artist. She reopened the cedar chest at the foot of Eleanor's bed and took out the pieces she had once considered too much for ordinary life. A pair of pearl earrings with a soft rose tint, a silk scarf printed with indigo cranes, the vintage black dress her mother wore to a museum fundraiser in 1998 when a senator's wife asked if she was the keynote speaker and Vivian had answered, "No, darling. I am the reason the keynote speaker is prepared." Naomi smiled when she remembered that story. She needed more of that bloodline in her posture. She also began writing again. Late at night, at the old study desk, she filled page after page in blue ink, not about Ethan exactly, though he appeared in the margins of everything, but about language, performance, omission, class, and the quiet brutality of being curated by someone who claimed to love you. Her sentences returned cautiously at first, then with growing force. They were better than she remembered, sharper, less eager to please. One Thursday afternoon, Helen called Naomi into her office, where rain moved in silver sheets across the tall windows, and a tray of untouched tea cooled beside a stack of event folders. "I need someone to attend the St. Clair Grand on Saturday," Helen said. "The Whitmore Foundation Gala has added a late cultural exchange segment after Monsieur Beauchamp's remarks. They are desperate to appear internationally minded this year, and one of our board members secured 2 guest credentials through the consular office. I had planned to send Robert, but he has influenza, and frankly Robert speaks French the way men apologize to women they never deserved." Naomi did not react visibly, though the room seemed to narrow for a second around the sound of that name. Helen slid the cream invitation across the desk. Naomi recognized the paper immediately. Same black and gold edging. Same polished arrogance. This time, however, her own name had been written in careful ink at the bottom by a foundation assistant who understood protocol. Naomi Elise Carter, Mercer Institute for Cultural Exchange. No one's wife. No one's hidden guest. No borrowed legitimacy. Just her name, resting where it belonged. "You do not have to go," Helen said, studying her with the respectful directness age sometimes earns. "I am asking because you would be excellent, not because I enjoy theatrics." Naomi placed her fingertips on the card and let the silence settle before answering. "No," she said softly. "I think perhaps theatrics are exactly what the evening deserves." Helen's mouth lifted in a knowing smile. Then was something unforgettable. That night Naomi stood in Eleanor's bedroom before the old wardrobe and opened the garment bag containing the black dress from 1998. It was not dramatic in the obvious sense. No glitter. No plunging neckline. No desperate attempt to announce value through excess. It was silk crepe, long and column clean, with a structured waist, elegant sleeves, and a neckline that framed the collarbone like restraint made visible. Under lesser light, it would read as simple. Under chandeliers, it would read as power. Naomi held it against herself and saw, not revenge, but return. On the vanity, beside the dress, she placed the rose pearls, the sapphire necklace, and a slim silver bracelet her grandmother had worn to every important lecture she ever gave. Then she looked at her reflection in the mirror, at the deep brown skin Ethan had once touched with private tenderness and public neglect, at the eyes now steadier than grief, at the mouth no longer shaped around silence. Transformation, she realized, was not a costume change. It was the discipline of refusing to enter the next chapter dressed in the fears someone else assigned to you. Across the river, Ethan was likely preparing for the same gala with the rigid efficiency of a man accustomed to controlling outcomes. Vanessa would be selecting earrings. Staff would be confirming seating charts. Press lists would be adjusted. Every detail polished. Every angle managed. But none of them knew the room had already shifted. Because the woman Ethan once told she could not survive that world was not coming back to ask for space in it. She was arriving under her own name, with inherited grace in her spine, history at her throat, and a silence so composed it would make everyone else sound unprepared. By the time Naomi zipped the garment bag closed, The city outside had gone dark except for windows and traffic and the occasional blur of a late ferry moving across the East River like a line of light. She touched the invitation once more, then set it beside her notebook. Saturday was not a reunion. It was not even a confrontation, not in the crude sense. It was something much rarer. A correction. And corrections, when written by the right hand, do not scream. They endure. Saturday arrived with the kind of October cold that sharpened the city into something almost ceremonial. Manhattan looked rinsed clean beneath a pale blue sky, its glass towers catching afternoon light like upright blades. And by 6:30 the entrance of the St. Clair Grand was already glowing with polished brass, camera flashes, and black cars idling in a line that seemed to promise importance simply by existing. Naomi stepped from a town car 2 blocks away rather than at the main entrance, not because she feared being seen, but because she wanted the small private walk that would let her enter the evening with her own rhythm instead of the one the spectacle demanded. The silk crepe of her black dress moved quietly against her legs as she crossed the sidewalk, the hem skimming just above her ankles, the cut elegant enough to command attention only after people looked twice. Around her throat rested Eleanor's sapphire necklace, deep blue against warm brown skin, and at her wrists the silver bracelet and rose pearl earrings caught the streetlights with a restrained glow. Her curls, shaped softly away from her face, gave her profile a grace that felt neither modern nor old-fashioned, only assured. She was not dressed like a woman hoping to be chosen. She was dressed like a woman who had already chosen herself. Inside the St. Clair Grand, the lobby rose in marble and mirrored light, all chandeliers and fresh white orchids, and a string quartet positioned near the sweeping staircase as though elegance could be arranged on cue. Naomi handed over her invitation to the attendant, who glanced down, then up, his expression shifting instantly into respect. "Good evening, Miss Carter." "Welcome." The name landed gently, but it echoed through her with more force than he could have known. Miss Carter, not an accessory, not a question mark, not a guest waiting to be defined by the man beside her. Helen Mercer's second ticket had gone to one of the Institute's younger trustees, Daniel Reeves, a museum attorney with thoughtful eyes, impeccable manners, and the rare talent of making conversation feel like room enough to breathe. He met Naomi near the staircase in a dark navy tuxedo, offered his arm with easy courtesy, and smiled in a way that held neither curiosity nor pity. "You look like the answer to a question nobody here was prepared to ask," he said. Naomi's lips curved faintly. "That may be the kindest legal statement I have ever heard." Together they entered the ballroom, and for one suspended moment nothing happened at all. The room did not gasp. No violins startled. No glasses shattered in cinematic obedience. The power of real entrances was always quieter than that. It began in glances. One donor pausing mid-sentence. A board member looking twice. A woman in emerald turning slightly to whisper to the man beside her. Recognition did not arrive because Naomi had made herself loud. It arrived because she had stopped making herself small. The ballroom itself was a study in cultivated influence. Gold light poured down from tiers of crystal. Round tables bloomed with ivory roses and black tapered candles. Waiters moved with silver trays through currents of perfume, tailored wool, and old family certainty. At the far end of the room, beneath the foundation crest and a projection of charitable milestones, Ethan Whitmore stood in conversation with 2 European investors and the city's deputy mayor, every inch the architect of the evening's authority. Vanessa Hale was beside him in a column gown the color of burgundy wine, sleek and immaculate, one manicured hand resting lightly on the back of his chair as though possession could be signaled through posture alone. Naomi felt Daniel slow very slightly at her side as he noticed where her gaze had gone. "Do you want to leave?" he asked quietly. The question was so respectful it almost hurt. Naomi looked at the room, at the polished years of exclusion gathered under one ceiling, at Ethan inhabiting the public life from which he had edited her so cleanly that some of these people likely believed he had always moved through the world unaccompanied. Then she looked back at Daniel. "No," she said. "I want to arrive." They moved deeper into the ballroom. A few people greeted Daniel, and through him Naomi was introduced properly, not extravagantly, just with the ordinary dignity Ethan had denied her for 10 years. "Ms. Carter from the Mercer Institute. Naomi Carter. Naomi Elise Carter." Each version of her name returned another inch of air to her lungs. An elderly patron with silver gloves asked whether she had known Eleanor Carter, and when Naomi answered, "She was my grandmother," the woman touched her arm with something close to delight. "My goodness," she said. "I attended one of her lectures at Barnard in 1987. Your grandmother could make a room stand straighter." Naomi smiled. "She tried very hard to teach me the same." Across the room, Ethan turned then, perhaps called by instinct, perhaps by the strange pull people feel when a story they thought they controlled begins rewriting itself in their peripheral vision. His eyes found Naomi immediately. Even from that distance, she saw the exact second recognition struck. His expression did not collapse. Ethan Whitmore was too disciplined for visible shock. But something in his posture stilled with surgical precision, as if the entire architecture of the evening had shifted half an inch beneath him, and only he could feel the crack. Vanessa followed his gaze a beat later. Her smile remained in place, but only just. Naomi did not look away. She did not lift her chin higher or harden her mouth into performance. She simply held the moment with the same composure she had carried through grief, return, and transformation. Beside her, Daniel asked whether she would like sparkling water or champagne. Naomi chose sparkling water. Clean, clear, unblurred. At 7:45, dinner service began. Names glowed on place, cards beneath candlelight. Naomi's seat, secured through the Institute, placed her at a table near the diplomatic delegation and only 2 tables away from Ethan's. Not close enough for conversation, close enough for consequence. As she settled into her chair, smoothing the black silk over her knees with elegant hands, she felt no tremor of panic, no urge to flee, no secret wish for Ethan to rescue or reclaim her. The chapter had already ended in a Brooklyn apartment with open windows and old letters. Tonight was not about asking him to see her. Tonight was about letting the room do it first. And as the orchestra softened into a low arrangement of strings and crystal stemware, began catching candlelight like coded signals across the ballroom, Naomi understood that some women walk into history in red dresses and thunder. Others do it in black silk and silence. But either way, the room remembers. By the time the dessert plates were cleared and the last pour of coffee began moving through the room, the ballroom had settled into that dangerous phase of elite gatherings when the evening seemed polished on the surface, but every important calculation was happening underneath it. Deals were no longer being announced. They were being measured. Alliances were no longer being introduced. They were being tested. Naomi sat with one hand resting lightly against the stem of her water glass, listening as the vice president of a Paris cultural consortium described an upcoming partnership initiative with the kind of diplomatic charm that made half the table nod before they fully understood what was at stake. Daniel, seated to her left, leaned in occasionally with a thoughtful question. Across from her, an older museum patron asked whether the Mercer Institute still intended to revive its public lecture series on transatlantic black artists. Naomi answered with calm precision, her voice neither too soft nor too eager, and each time she spoke she could feel the room adjusting to her in increments too subtle for anyone to name and too real for anyone to stop. At the front of the ballroom, Ethan had resumed his role with impressive discipline. If his attention strayed more often than it should have toward Naomi's table, only someone who knew him intimately would have noticed. Vanessa, however, noticed everything. She laughed a fraction too brightly at the deputy mayor's joke. She touched Ethan's sleeve once, then removed her hand as though remembering too late that possession became embarrassing the moment it had an audience. After the foundation chair gave brief remarks about global literacy initiatives, the lights softened and a final program segment was announced, a short conversational exchange with Monsieur Laurent Beecham on international cultural diplomacy, meant to give the evening that last wash of refinement wealthy donors loved because it made philanthropy feel like character. Monsieur Beecham took the stage with the polished ease of a man who had spent decades in rooms where history was negotiated over crystal and linen. He began in English, elegant and dry, thanking the Whitmore Foundation for its generosity and speaking about the importance of preserving culture in an era obsessed with velocity. The room responded well. Heads nodded. Glasses lifted. Then, with the graceful unpredictability of someone testing the depth of the room beneath its glamour, he shifted into French. The transition was effortless, almost musical, and for one brief moment the ballroom continued smiling as though nothing had changed. Then it became painfully clear that most of the people who had built their identities around being worldly were now relying entirely on posture. A few guests exchanged uncertain glances. One table gave a polite laugh too late. Vanessa's expression hardened into the fixed brightness of a woman who had just realized she was standing in an expensive room without the right currency. Ethan remained still, but Naomi could see the minute change in his jaw from across the ballroom. Monsieur Beecham continued, now speaking more quickly, describing a proposed collaboration involving archival restoration, community translation programs, and a private endowment that could dramatically elevate the Foundation's global standing if handled correctly. Then he paused, looked toward Ethan's table, and asked a question in French so direct that even those who did not understand the language understood something had gone wrong. Silence followed. Not catastrophic silence. Worse, cultivated silence. The kind wealthy rooms create when they are trying to protect someone important from the fact that he has just been found wanting. Ethan inclined his head with impeccable control, clearly searching for a diplomatic bridge back into English. Vanessa glanced toward the event coordinator near the stage, then toward the program notes in front of her, as though one of them might suddenly begin speaking French on her behalf. Naomi set down her glass. The sound was almost nothing, a soft crystal note against linen, but Daniel turned toward her immediately. "Are you about to save this room?" he asked under his breath. Naomi did not smile. "No," she said softly. "I am about to answer it." When she rose, she did so without spectacle. No rush. No visible claim to the spotlight. She simply stood, the black silk of her dress falling in one clean line beneath the chandeliers, and every nearby conversation dissolved as if the room itself had sensed a correction entering motion. Naomi addressed Monsieur Beecham in French with a voice so composed it seemed to restore oxygen to the entire ballroom. She thanked him for his remarks, responded directly to his question about the archival initiative, and with elegant economy clarified the terms of the proposed collaboration in a way that made the purpose of the exchange suddenly visible even to those who did not understand the language. Her accent was refined, her phrasing exact, her tone warm without ever becoming deferential. She did not perform fluency. She inhabited it. Beauchamp's face lit instantly, first with surprise, then with unmistakable pleasure. He replied at length, asking where she had studied, referencing Eleanor Carter by name after Naomi mentioned her grandmother's work, and the energy in the room changed so completely it almost felt audible. A few guests leaned forward now, not because they had been instructed to admire her, but because admiration had become the most intelligent response available. Naomi answered him again, this time weaving effortlessly between French and English so the broader audience could follow, translating not only the words but the significance beneath them. She spoke of memory as public inheritance, of translation as dignity, of cultural exchange not as a decorative project for wealthy foundations, but as a serious form of civic responsibility. Her sentences moved with the measured authority of someone who understood the room and was no longer interested in shrinking for it. When she finished, the applause did not erupt immediately. It rose, slow at first, then fuller, then undeniable. The deputy mayor was clapping. The museum patrons were clapping. Daniel stood first at her table, not out of theater, but out of instinctive respect. Even those who could not have summarized a single point she made understood they had witnessed something rarer than polished entertainment. They had witnessed legitimacy appear where they had not expected to find it. Across the ballroom, Ethan did not clap right away. He simply looked at Naomi with an expression stripped of every convenient lie he had used for 10 years. No room was too sophisticated for her. No crowd too complex. No world too polished. The failure had never belonged to Naomi. It belonged to the man who had looked at brilliance and called it unfit for daylight. Vanessa lowered her eyes to the tablecloth, her immaculate posture finally touched by something close to embarrassment. And Naomi, standing in the gold wash of the chandeliers with her grandmother's sapphire resting against her throat and the whole room newly awake to her presence, understood with perfect calm that this was not revenge. Revenge was noisy. This was something far cleaner. This was the truth, spoken in a language the room had almost forgotten how to hear, and once truth has been translated properly, it becomes very difficult to hide again. Applause has a way of sounding different depending on who earns it. For years, Ethan Whitmore had lived inside applause that arrived on schedule, applause tied to acquisitions, keynote speeches, strategic donations, magazine covers, and the polished mythology of a man who knew how to build power without ever appearing to chase it. But the applause rising now beneath the chandeliers of the St. Clair Grand did not belong to him, and that made it feel less like celebration than judgment. Naomi returned to her seat with the same calm composure with which she had stood, but the room had changed its axis. Conversations no longer curved instinctively toward Ethan's table. They bent toward hers. Monsieur Beecham requested the honor of meeting her properly after the program. Two museum trustees asked Daniel for an introduction before the coffee service had even ended. A woman from the New York Philharmonic Board leaned across the aisle to say, with breathless admiration, that Naomi had been extraordinary. Extraordinary. Ethan heard the word twice in under a minute and felt it land like a private indictment. Vanessa sat very still beside him, one hand wrapped around her coffee cup as if warmth could restore control. "You knew," she said under her breath, not looking at him. Ethan kept his eyes forward. "No," he answered, and for perhaps the first time that evening, he spoke without strategy. He had not known. That was the ruinous part. He had lived beside Naomi for 10 years, had eaten at the same table, slept under the same roof, listened to her speak in quiet, measured sentences, watched her move through private life with effortless grace, and still he had not known the full architecture of her mind because he had never forced himself to ask the kind of questions that require humility. He had mistaken gentleness for limitation. He had mistaken elegance for dependence. He had mistaken privacy for absence. Across the ballroom, Naomi rose briefly as Monsieur Beecham approached her table with both hands extended in delighted greeting, his silver hair bright. Beneath the lights, his admiration visible enough that nearby guests subtly repositioned themselves for proximity. Ethan watched Naomi receive him with poised warmth, neither dazzled nor overly modest, and the sight unsettled him more deeply than any public humiliation ever could. She was not performing above herself. That was what made the truth unbearable. She was simply standing at her own level, and he was seeing it far too late. For the next 20 minutes, the room educated him with merciless efficiency. A foundation chair asked Daniel whether Ms. Carter might consider joining a spring planning committee. The deputy mayor's wife said she remembered Eleanor Carter and had no idea Naomi was family. A venture philanthropist from Chicago turned to Ethan himself, smiling with the careless cruelty of the socially oblivious, and asked, "Why have you never brought your wife to anything? She is the most interesting person here." Ethan held the smile expected of him and answered something polished, something forgettable, but inside, the sentence echoed with devastating precision. "Why have you never brought your wife to anything?" Because he had been afraid. There it was at last, stripped of the silk wrappings he had used for years. Not busy, not protective, not practical. Afraid. Afraid that her history was richer than his assumptions. Afraid that her presence would reveal the thinness of certain people he depended on. Afraid that in rooms built on status, Naomi might radiate something status could not manufacture, and he would have no control over how brightly she was seen. Ethan had spent a decade telling himself he was managing perception. In truth, he had been managing his own insecurity with the life of another human being. By the time the orchestra resumed with a final arrangement and guests began rising for the post-dinner reception, Ethan could no longer sit still beneath the illusion of command. He stood, excused himself from the cluster of donors now orbiting toward Naomi's side of the room, and moved across the floor with the contained force of a man walking toward the scene of his own moral failure. Naomi saw him coming before he reached her. Of course she did. She had always seen him more clearly than he deserved. Daniel, who had been speaking with a curator from Brussels, glanced from Ethan to Naomi and stepped back without fuss, his courtesy somehow making Ethan feel even less dignified. "Naomi," Ethan said, stopping near her chair. He meant to sound composed. Instead, he sounded like a man speaking through the remains of certainty. Naomi turned fully toward him. Under the chandeliers, her expression was calm, but not soft. Calm was far more dangerous. "Ethan." He looked at the sapphire at her throat, at the black silk dress he had never seen before, at the steady intelligence in her eyes that now seemed impossible not to have recognized. and for a moment his voice failed him. Around them, the ballroom moved in tasteful currents of music, crystal, and low conversation, but Ethan had the distinct sensation of standing alone in an exposed place. "I was wrong," he said quietly. Naomi did not rescue him by pretending not to understand. "Yes," she answered. That was all. No anger. No invitation to elaborate. Just the clean acceptance of fact. Ethan drew a breath that seemed to cost him. "I should have brought you into this world years ago." Naomi's gaze held his without trembling. "It was never your world to grant me access to." He closed his eyes for half a second, not long enough to be dramatic, just long enough to reveal how accurately she had struck the center of it. There were apologies men offer when they want forgiveness. And then there were the rarer, more devastating apologies that arrive when a man finally sees himself clearly and wishes he had not waited until damage made clarity expensive. Ethan was standing at the edge of the second kind. "I thought I was protecting the life I built," he said. "No," Naomi replied, her voice almost unbearably gentle. "You were protecting your fear that I might outgrow the version of me you found convenient." The words did not wound because they were cruel. They wounded because they were complete. Ethan looked at her then, not as a wife, not as an extension of his private life, not as a polished figure he had once kept behind carefully chosen walls, but as a woman whose dignity had survived his omissions and returned sharper than his success. For the first time in a decade, he understood the scale of what he had lost was not merely affection or companionship. It was witness. Naomi had once looked at him with belief. She had once made his ambition feel human, his silence feel like depth, his home feel inhabited by something finer than wealth. And he had traded that for optics, for control, for the approval of rooms that, tonight, seemed suddenly cheap in the places he used to call elite. Vanessa appeared several yards away, speaking to an event coordinator with forced concentration, but Ethan no longer looked in her direction. The room no longer blurred Naomi with other women or other choices. There was only the clean, devastating shape of consequence. A marriage had not cracked because of scandal. It had thinned under years of exclusion until one truth, spoken aloud over candlelight, had finally made the structure visible. Ethan had not lost Naomi tonight. He had lost her piece by piece every time he asked her to stay home and called it love. Every time he let a room assume he was alone. Every time he accepted admiration built on an edited version of his life. Regret did not descend on him like thunder. It settled like winter. Precise, inescapable, cold enough to make everything honest. And as Naomi inclined her head slightly and turned to greet another guest calling her name with new respect, Ethan remained where he was for one silent second longer than dignity allowed, understanding at last that the cruelest punishment in the world is not public embarrassment. It is finally recognizing the value of what you hid only after the world stands up to applaud it. The reception thinned by degrees, not because the night had lost its glamour, but because glamour can only sustain people for so long after truth has entered the room. By 11:15, the orchestra had softened into a final arrangement near the terrace doors. Coffee cups stood abandoned beside lipstick-marked glasses, and clusters of donors drifted toward elevators carrying with them the polished murmur of names, impressions, and tomorrow's retellings. Naomi had just finished a brief conversation with the Brussels curator, who invited her to visit a private archive in the spring, when she felt Ethan's presence return at the edge of her stillness. He did not interrupt immediately. That alone told her more than his apology had. Ethan Whitmore had spent his life entering rooms as if they were already prepared for him. Tonight he waited. Naomi turned only after the curator had moved away, and when she did, she found Ethan standing a few feet from her near the long terrace windows, Manhattan glowing behind him in fractured reflections of gold and black. Without the shield of a table, donors, or formal programming between them, he looked less like the architect of an empire and more like a man standing in the weather of his own choices. "Walk with me," he said quietly. It was not a command, not even close. Naomi considered him for a moment, then nodded once. They stepped out onto the terrace where the October air carried just enough cold to make every breath feel exact. Below them, Park Avenue gleamed with late traffic and disciplined light. Above them, the city rose in glass and limestone and ambition. The same city that had once felt like Ethan's kingdom and now seemed too honest for ownership. For a few steps neither of them spoke. Their shoes moved over the stone in a rhythm that would have felt intimate once. Now it felt ceremonial. At the far end of the terrace, where a row of white chrysanthemums softened the railing and the orchestra could be heard only faintly through the doors, Naomi stopped. Ethan stopped too, keeping a respectful distance that would have been admirable if it had not arrived 10 years too late. "You knew I was not who you told yourself I was," Naomi said at last, looking out over the avenue rather than at him. Her voice carried no accusation, which made the sentence land harder. "You knew I was educated. You knew I was raised around books, music, and people who mattered for reasons beyond money. You heard me read in French in our own living room. You watched me correct museum labels for fun. You listened to me discuss diplomacy with my mother on holidays. So do not tell me tonight that you simply did not know." Ethan said nothing. The city below them moved in bright lines and disciplined speed, indifferent to confession. Naomi turned then, and the sapphire at her throat caught a shard of terrace light, so dark and vivid it looked almost like memory made visible. "You knew," she repeated. "You just preferred a version of me that stayed inside the house." Ethan's face did not harden. It gave way. "Yes," he said. The single word sounded stripped of every defense he had ever trusted. Naomi waited. She had earned the truth in full. Ethan looked beyond her for a moment, toward the blur of headlights threading below, as though language might be easier if he did not have to say it directly into the eyes of the person he had diminished. "When we married," he said, "I told myself I was protecting us. My family, my board, the circles I move in, they measure everything. Accent, history, background, lineage. They know how to smile and exclude in the same breath. I thought if I kept you away from that, I could keep one part of my life untouched by their judgment." Naomi's expression did not soften. "That is the story you told yourself because it made cowardice sound noble." The wind shifted, lifting one dark curl from her cheek before letting it fall again. Ethan took the words without protest. "You are right," he said. "It was cowardice. And it got worse because every year I delayed introducing you. The introduction became more complicated, then impossible, then embarrassing. Not because of you. Because I had already built a public life that pretended you were not central to it." Naomi looked at him with the stillness of a woman finally hearing the clean shape of the betrayal she had survived. "Do you know what hurt the most?" she asked. "It was not missing the parties. I did not need chandeliers, speeches, or stale people applauding the right charities. It was knowing that the man who heard me most clearly in private chose to let the world assume I was not worth presenting in daylight." Ethan's throat moved. He had no elegant reply to that. Perhaps none existed. "I loved you," he said after a long moment. And even now he sounded like a man discovering how incomplete a sentence could be. Naomi's eyes remained on his. "I know you did. In the way you knew how. But love that requires a woman to shrink so a man can feel socially safe is not love in its final form. It is admiration with conditions. It is affection without courage." The words settled between them with the permanence of something carved rather than spoken. Inside the ballroom, laughter rose and fell behind glass. A server passed through the doorway carrying a tray of empty champagne flutes. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn echoed off stone. The world continued with its ordinary noise while a marriage was being translated into its true language at last. Ethan stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, only enough to let her hear the absence of performance in him. "What do I do now?" he asked. It was not the question of a billionaire. It was the question of a man who had run out of leverage and finally understood the poverty of that condition. Naomi looked out over the city again, and when she answered, her voice was quiet enough that he had to listen with all of himself. "You learn the difference between loving a woman and managing her visibility. You learn that dignity is not something a husband grants when the room seems friendly enough. You learn that if you are ashamed to stand beside the person who loves you, then the shame belongs to you, not to her." Ethan lowered his head for a second, and in that small movement Naomi saw the first honest grief he had shown all evening. Not grief for being embarrassed. Grief for understanding. "I cannot ask you to forgive me tonight," he said. "No," Naomi replied. "You cannot." Then, because mercy and weakness are not the same thing, she added, "And I am not punishing you, Ethan. I am simply refusing to keep paying for a lie that only benefited you." He looked at her then as if the full architecture of consequence had finally come into focus. The old instinct in him, to negotiate, persuade, promise change in clean strategic language, flickered once and died under the weight of her clarity. Naomi had moved beyond the phase of marriage where words could renovate what years had hollowed out. There are moments in life when closure does not arrive as a door slamming or a scene exploding. It arrives as a woman standing in cold air, dressed in black silk, speaking the truth so calmly that the man who once controlled the narrative realizes he has no lines left worth saying. Naomi touched the bracelet at her wrist, Eleanor's silver cool beneath her fingertips, and felt not triumph but alignment. Ethan had not destroyed her future. He had merely revealed what kind of life could no longer contain her. "We should go back in," she said at last. "People will notice." Ethan almost smiled, but the expression broke before it fully formed. "For once," he said, "I think they should." Naomi inclined her head slightly, then turned toward the ballroom doors. Ethan moved beside her, but not as an owner, not as a savior, not as the man who once believed rooms belonged to him to distribute, only as someone walking next to the consequence of his own fear. And when they stepped back inside beneath the chandeliers, the music, and the gaze of a room that had finally learned her name, Naomi understood that the past had not been undone. It had been answered. Sometimes that is the closest thing to justice the heart ever gets. And sometimes, if the woman has suffered with enough dignity, it is more than enough.